Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Randy Bell. I'm the Managing Director of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Pleased to welcome you to the second day of the Global Energy Forum as we kick off our plenary sessions. We're here to talk about a topic that's really captured the imagination of the energy community over the past year, the impact of transportation innovation on oil demand. Now, we're not going to be talking about solar planes and flying cars. That's maybe a little too far off in the future, but we're going to be talking about something a little closer to reality here, but that's sort of fun. And actually, I think they're building cars like that in Dubai right now. So it's uncertain, of course, what exactly oil demand's future will look like, but there are innovations in the transportation sector that are going to alter the energy mix. This morning we're going to have a slightly different type of presentation. First, we're going to hear two technology presentations from Renault in electric vehicles and Etihad on biojet fuels. And then we're going to hear from three experts who are going to discuss what these technology advances and others mean for the future of the energy mix and geopolitics. So first, the technology presentations. So the Renault-Nissan alliance is the largest EV manufacturer in the world. You hear a lot about Tesla, but Renault-Nissan is making and selling these vehicles. We have with us Mark Carson, Director of Customer Services and Quality at Renault Middle East, and he's going to brief us on Renault's next-generation EV technology. Mark's been with Renault for nearly 20 years, so he brings some excellent perspective into the trajectory of these technologies and why this moment in the technology story really matters. So Mark, welcome up to the stage. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to give you a run through really on innovation and where we are from Renault as an automotive manufacturer today. Okay. What we see today is an ever-changing face of the automotive industry and a shift from oil more to electricity. Government incentives and policies in the past 2 years have changed and dramatically changed the face of the way the automotive industry will be. As you can see there is a shift now to move towards from internal combustion engine to alternative source vehicles, mainly electricity. For us, electricity is one challenge. As a consumer, the thing we find with consumers is range anxiety. Range anxiety, and we see with the car will change as what we know as the car. Autonomous vehicle, connected vehicle. Over the next 5 years, we will see major developments in this area and field. Range anxiety is increasing all the time. If I take back and I look over the past 2 to 3 years, range anxiety has gone from around about 100 kilometres to 300-400 kilometres, with Tesla obviously 500 kilometres plus. But we see this all the time. From an automotive point of view, what you can see here is now we're all working to the same forecast. Mainly, we're looking to increase the range from around about 200 to 400, and we're looking to charge a vehicle much faster. That's the most important thing. The first question you ever receive on electric vehicles is mainly based on the fact is how long and how quick it can charge. So if we take there from 2017, we see in the next 4 years that ranges will move to 400 to 500 kilometres, and we will see that charging times, for what we say for a 100-kilometre charge, we're looking down to about 15 minutes. In 2025, they're looking at premium vehicles being able to charge in 5 minutes for 100 kilometres. It's a mindset and a change of lifestyle. Wireless charging. Wireless charging is being developed all the time. It's another form of way to drive the vehicle. What we've seen this year, for us, for Renault, we've already working with different partners now in communication and energy supply. And we've seen with a European funded project, which is the Fabric project, we developed a test track for wireless charging, and we were charging at 20 kilowatts over 100 kilometres. So this is the future innovations that are coming to market or will come to market in the coming years. And finally, we need energy suppliers. The automotive industry is changing on the basis that we are now becoming involved with energy suppliers. Renault now is in the energy market as well, as the automotive market. And what we will see is, we know with electric vehicles there'll be a demand. A big demand on energy. Energy will change from fossil fuels to electricity, but already we're looking at the ways we charge cars. At peak point demand times during the day, during the evening, there's already applications available for electric vehicles, so you charge at the least peak demand time. It means you set the car up, you leave the car, it will charge when the grid requires you to charge on that basis. So it's just a few insights into innovation. And what we see, for us, it's a big change of mindset. For us, it's a big change in the way we do our business. But I think in every business, and with the energy market now, we will all change in the way we deliver. So thank you very much.
Now let me welcome Lyndon Koppel, Head of Sustainability at Etihad Aviation Group, to the stage. Etihad is doing some really fascinating work on locally produced biojet fuels in partnership with Masdar. And this conversation is often driven by a conversation about EVs, the oil demand conversation, but we also are going to see innovation in air transportation, shipping, et cetera. So it's really great to have this perspective. So her presentation should provide a really important perspective on where this is going over the next couple of years. Thank you, Lyndon.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. Thank you very much to Randy and to the Atlantic Council for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about our commitment towards development of biofuels for aviation. Just to put it in perspective very quickly, we're around 2%, this is international civil aviation, around 2% of man-made global carbon dioxide emissions, and even within the transport sector, around 12%. But nevertheless, there's an awful lot of focus on aviation in terms of trying to find ways to decarbonise. There's obviously a big challenge of the fact that we're reliant on liquid fuel. We're going to be reliant on some form of low-volume, high-mass liquid fuel for many, many years to come. You're talking about R&D cycles of 10 years or more. You're talking about production cycles of 10 to 15 years. You're talking about the use of the aircraft for 30 to 40 years. So even if we go way out to 2050, we're still talking about needing that liquid fuel. The industry came up with about 10 years ago quite an ambitious set of goals to try and address this issue within the industry. We knew that we were making about 1.5% efficiency improvements per year based on technology improvements. We came out with an ambitious 2020 carbon neutral growth target. That has now been adopted globally by ICAO, our international regulators, and we're now working towards a mechanism of carbon offsetting to offset that post-2020 growth. And the most ambitious one is saying by 2050, we feel that we'll be in a position to say that we'll be 50% less emissions than we were in 2005. If we have a look at how we're going to kind of achieve that, we know that our technology improvements, our operational improvements, and in particular our infrastructure improvements will allow quite a big wedge of reduction to be achieved. But we've still got a long way even to meet that carbon neutral growth and then go beyond that to that 2050 target. If you look at that kind of little space in the middle between the carbon neutral growth and then the green line down, that is the point where, before which we're going to have to apply this probably a carbon offsetting tool. But beyond that, we're really looking at something that will help decarbonise when it comes to the fuel, looking at some sort of biofuel. In terms of the challenges that we have within the industry, and the reason that the industry has probably been a bit slower than, say, the ground transport industry when it comes to alternative fuels, is that it has to be a drop-in fuel. It has to be fully mixable with the fuel that we use now. We can't have the luxury of having some aircraft that can use one type of fuel and another aircraft that can use another. This is where the term biofuel is a little bit misleading, because it's actually an alternative way of making the same fuel. We end up ultimately with a jet fuel. Sometimes what I say is we're simply not waiting 2 million years for fossil fuel to be formed from hydrocarbon-based materials. We're simply using materials that we potentially have now, things like plant material, waste material. It's important that we get the pathway certified for use. You know, if you're taking a different form of feedstock, you have to take it through a different pathway to get that jet fuel, and they have to go through quite a long and detailed approval process through the ASTM. It's very important that we have a sustainable feedstock. There's been a lot of bad press around biofuels, and we're still fighting that issue. We have moved a long way since these first-generation biofuels, where there's considered to be potentially issues around food use and using arable land to maybe using other types of feedstocks. And of course, the cost parity is an issue also. In terms of what we're doing here on alternatives, we've got a pretty strong collaboration going on right now. We've got something called the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium. Etihad's a founding member, together with the Masdar Institute and Boeing. We've now got ADNOC joining us. It's very important that we have our national oil company engaged in this. We see them as playing a big role, and then a number of other partners as well, including GE, Safran, and Bauer. And this is what we're focused on, looking at a sustainable feedstock. Looking at a sustainable feedstock that can be developed here in a desert environment on low quality land. And this was a concept that actually Boeing and Masdar came to me with about 7-8 years ago and said we could potentially grow a crop here in the desert. I was, of course, extremely skeptical about this, but then when they talked about it being a seawater system, not only that, but it's effectively built around aquaculture. We have about 80% of our seafood here is imported. If we can improve that, the aquaculture here, which is something that the government's taken a big lead on, we could actually effectively provide the clean-up for what is potentially a very dirty industry. So we're taking that salt water with all the nutrients and the fish waste, we're putting it through our fields of this plant called Salicornia, which is a saltwater tolerant plant. That's extremely important, so we can grow this on the sort of desert lands that we have here. And then it will go through a third process through mangroves, which are great for a source of carbon sequestration and storage. So we worked on this for a number of years at kind of lab scale, looking at the kind of system, what the kind of yields were, lots of different factors taken into account. We then, around a year and a half ago now, we actually built this at small scale. So at Masdar Institute, we now have a 2-hectare facility where we have fish ponds, we have the growth of this plant, the Salicornia. There's Dr. Thani, who's our Minister of Climate Change and Environment at the opening event. We've done our first harvest. We've now need to extract the oil from the seeds. This plant's got a high oil content in the seed, and that is potentially going to be our main source of biomass. We're working on very, very detailed techno-economic analysis of this, because ultimately, if we can't get the yields, then we're not going to get the fuel, and it's just not going to be commercially viable. We've got that 2-hectare facility right now. It's a pilot. The next stage is scaling up to 200 hectares. And what we're seeing right now is that just the aquaculture part itself makes that system commercially viable. We need to get a very cheap source of feedstock. That's the only way that it can work commercially for us. If we can make the aquaculture part commercially viable, then that allows the entire system to be viable. So we can see here we've got our shrimp, we've got the fish and shrimp, the aquaculture part. For us, we're interested primarily in the seeds, but potentially in the biomass. Potentially you can turn the sugar part of the biomass also into fuel. There's technology pathways for that. But also we found that there might be potentially chemicals in there that can add to the whole value chain. And then, of course, we have the added value of the carbon sequestration and potentially using this sort of system in terms of carbon offsetting. So we could actually even consider using the system as part of our compliance to this global carbon offsetting program. That kind of said in a slightly different way, the fact that the seafood is very much something that we can use locally because we're currently importing so much seafood. The seeds for the jet fuel, biomass potentially for jet fuel for others, the carbon credits, and it is about cleaning up that industry as well. It is providing ecosystem preservation and, of course, that wastewater treatment. Finally, very detailed slide, but just to show that we have looked at all the strengths, the opportunities, the weaknesses. There's still a long way to go. That plant has never gone through any commercial plant breeding program. It's still effectively a wild plant. We don't know enough about the yield right now. We're working with plant experts. We're doing cultivars. We're actually taking the best of certain seeds that we have to kind of see how we can overall increase the yield in that over time. I won't talk any more about it, but if you want more information, then please do come and find me. The very final thing I want to mention as well, it's not just about feedstock. We spent a few years together with a number of our partners in writing this roadmap report. It's not just about the feedstock, it's about distribution, investment, policy measures, how we're going to actually make this whole value chain and supply chain work for us. If you want to get copies of that, I can send you a link so you can read that report. It's available in both Arabic and English. And very finally, in this year of Zayed, a quote from our late founding father of the UAE, which emphasizes the fact that we do need to diversify away from an oil-dependent economy, and this certainly would support that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to be on the first flight with that, okay? I want to also just take this opportunity to thank Etihad as our official carrier, and also let you know that there are some Renault Zoes, 3 EVs downstairs, parked out front, that you can take a look at. I wanted to have these 2 tech presentations before the panel discussion, just to make it feel a little bit real, what we're about to talk about, because these innovations really are exciting, and they're happening around the world in so many different ways. So let me invite the panelists up here. First, we have Kamal Ben Nasser, Chief Economist at ADNOC, who's done a bunch of work on EVs and what it means for energy. Robert Johnston, CEO of the Eurasia Group and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and one of my partners in crime. And then Thomas Marchetti, President of Energy Intelligence. Come on up, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Each of these panelists has been thinking quite a lot about these various issues and brings some unique expertise to the table. Kamal representing an oil company that's increasing its global reach, RJ possessing well over 20 years working with energy producers, and Tom being one of the most forward-thinking leaders in energy analysis. We're really happy to have you on stage. This panel has been inspired by a project that RJ is working on at the Atlantic Council called Shifting Gears. It's funded by the Smith Richardson Foundation, and it's looking at the potential changes in the transportation industry, what that means for energy geopolitics. We're going to have RJ talk about that for 2 minutes and just set the scene for what we're going to what questions we're going to ask here.
2 minutes, start the timer right now. Thank you very much, Randy, and thanks to everyone for coming today on this bright morning. Yeah, so just to describe the project that we're working on, we're quite excited about this, and I think about, Randy gave the title of the project. To be clear, it's not a peak demand project, right? That's sort of a misleading term, but I do think it's a useful analytical framework thinking about how certain trends are coming together. Yesterday, Megan O'Sullivan, if you saw her presentation, she had the Venn diagram showing the convergence between energy and foreign policy, which I certainly agree with. We would just add the climate policy and transportation policy piece as well to our Venn diagram here. What we're trying to do is understand these structural shifts that we just heard about and understand a little bit more about the time frame for those and what that's going to mean for geopolitics. Who are the winners and losers in terms of producers and consumers? And how do you look at that? And I think you want to look at it in terms of assessing the strength of political institutions of those countries, their resilience to handle potentially significant shocks and changes in the energy mix, and also their ability to implement programs of economic diversification. It's similar to the quote that we just heard from. The particular focus here in our project will be on policy. There's obviously a lot of great work being done on technology and on consumer behavior, but really, as political scientists, we want to look at the policy side, the incentives, the mandates, carbon policy, subsidies, fuel efficiency standards, that whole suite of policies, which ones are working and which ones are not. We also want to take a portfolio approach. We've already heard this morning about electric vehicles and biofuels for jet fuel, but there's many other things we could talk about. Certainly, we want to look at the industrial sector, things like smart cities, things like autonomous vehicles, not just electric vehicles. That's an important story, but not the only one. It seems like it captures most of the media attention. Final 2 points. Our study will probably be quite focused on Asia. Why? Because I think we all know that about 80% of the expected oil demand growth will be in Asia. And the India and Southeast Asia story in particular is of great interest. If we look what's happened in China, is China going to be the Detroit of the 21st century, the sort of leader on electric vehicles and batteries? And can that mix of energy security, environmental policy, industrial policy we see in China that has really incubated and led to the growth of the electric vehicle sector there and alternative transport sector there, can that be also developed in places like India and Southeast Asia as well? And then lastly, I think sometimes this debate gets seen as sort of a long-term question. right? Well, is there a peak in 2030 or 2040 or 2050? And therefore, should we really be spending our time worrying about it now? And I would say the answer to that is yes. And I think there's some interesting questions here, which I'm sure my colleagues will have a view on, which is, do these long-term uncertainties on the demand side, are they impacting long-cycle upstream projects in oil today? Right? Maybe that's one of the reasons why everyone likes U.S. shale and is more cautious about the longer cycle investments in the deep water and oil sands and other plays. Maybe. That's certainly good food for thought. That's a brief overview of our project, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, RJ. And just to note, RJ just published a paper through the Atlantic Council on Asian industrial policy and what that means for EVs, et cetera. If there should be some at the partner desk, and if we're out, you can find it online. So let's get started with the conversation. And as we discussed earlier, let's not be polite. Let's have a discussion here. And I hope there's some disagreement. So you just saw two really great presentations about innovative technologies that are coming to market in one way, shape, or form. And as I said, there are some EVs downstairs that you can drive here today. So this change is real. What do you think this means for the future of the energy mix? What are the biggest drivers that could lead to one energy mix outcome or another? So first with Kamal.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thanks to the Atlantic Council for the invitation, and congratulations on the many achievements so far. I wanted to start with a symbol. A couple of days ago, I was coming to this hotel, and there were some very beautiful cars, Italian-made, and absolutely fantastic feast of engineering. However, single digits in terms of miles per gallon. 2 days later, we have 3 beautiful electric cars from a French manufacturer. So perhaps there is a message there. But looking, ahead, if we go 2017, I think we should be about 3 million electric cars. What's the outlook? We look at both the IEA and the OPEC. They are not very far apart in terms of 2040 in their central scenario. We are looking at about 300 million cars by 2040. So we're going from 3 to 300, a factor of 100 going forward. This could seem a lot, but if we look at the car stock, this would be about 15%, up to 20% of the car stock. So that is significant, but not overwhelming. Now, what are the ingredients from going from 3 to 300? Basically, there is another 100 number, which is the decrease of battery cost, which are today about $230, $240 per kilowatt hour, and going to about $100 per kilowatt hour. The biggest concern in going there is what makes the batteries. If we rely on cobalt, if we rely on lithium, we have seen quite a steep increase over last year in terms of those commodity prices. And if you talk about concentration of those minerals, actually it's way more concentrated than what we see in fossil fuels. Cobalt, for instance, you have 40% of the reserves that are in a single country, which is not very stable, by the way. So that is one concern. There are other factors that, if we look at the whole cycle, life cycle of an electric vehicle, we really need to look at it very carefully. In order to have an electric vehicle that is efficient, you need to have it much lighter. So you need to replace the metal parts by things like carbon fibers. And where do carbon fibers come from? They come from oil and gas. They come from petrochemicals, which makes the picture. We need to look at the complete picture. So if we look at the implications on the oil demand, I think it was mentioned yesterday, looking forward to 2040, there will be still about 12 million barrels per day additional demand for oil in the central scenario compared to today, 12 million. which is about split between petrochemicals on one side, then the marine and the aviation, and then the third one being the trucks. So that is the law. There are some caveats and things that we really need to look very seriously at is safety and security of the electric vehicles. We are going into more and more digital-enabled things, and cyber hacking is quite a concern. You could afford to be at home with your computer and have this hacking, okay? But if you are driving on the road and then you have someone hacking you, I think that is quite a threat. So I'm not trying to be negative, but these are things that we should consider.
That's a topic that was raised a couple times yesterday. As we electrify everything, there are increased risks from the cyber domain. Tom, what is your response to this?
Yeah, Randy, thank you for that. First, I want to thank the Atlanta Council for inviting me. I would like to thank the Ministry, their Excellencies, and Abu Dhabi for hosting this enlightening event. From our perspective at Energy Intelligence, there are three factors that will be the major drivers and the influence of the adoption for electric vehicles. One is obviously technology. You talked about the battery. I think the infrastructure is as equally important. I think one of the points I take away from the discussion and the presentation earlier was getting away from range anxiety. Right? And that's fine, but there also has to be grid stability, which the U.S. Deputy Secretary talked about, and that's equally important. We can talk about it a little bit later, but we've done a lot of work in thinking about the differences per se between China and India. They both have very strong policy support, but there is a lacking charging infrastructure available. And that brings us to our second point, which is policy. Now, policies are driven not only by government officials, but also by companies. What we've seen this year is an acceptance by the auto industry to abandon, essentially, internal combustion engines. Now, you might say, well, it was actually policy that created that. Right? Because the policy and the costs of meeting fuel efficiency standards were that onerous that they decided to pursue alternative avenues. But there's another variable that we pay attention to, and that's consumer behavior. And I think that that's one of the things that's often overlooked, and I haven't seen anybody yet that discuss how that fits into things. And I think that we'll find through artificial intelligence and also other types of learnings how to think about consumer behavior, and I'll give you an example. In the United States, there are 75% of commuters that commute alone. Less than 12% actually do rideshare. So the ability for technologies to figure out how to best change consumer behavior, on one side you might say as a skeptic, this isn't going to work. You have Uber doing it, you have Lyft doing it. What does an electric vehicle do to it? Well, maybe the way you can put together the components for the vehicle and change the configuration of the vehicle might make it and lend itself better for ride sharing. On the other side of it, over the past decade, you've seen a tremendous increase in the United States, for example, with the introduction of hybrids. CAFE standards have improved. What hasn't changed over the same exact time frame is the amount of fuel consumption per gallon. It hasn't worked. Why? Why hasn't it worked? Consumer behavior. Right? You take an example, if you have two vehicles in your home and one might be a hybrid, one might be a Denali, right? Well, you might say that the most efficient use of your own personal fleet should be to use your hybrid on long distance travel. However, when you think about highway safety requirements, you're more likely to choose the bigger vehicle and use a smaller vehicle, as inefficient as that might be when you think about how you allocate your own personal fleet for shorter distance travel. So I think those types of things are also going to influence the ability of the market to not only come up with the innovation and have the policies, but to show the results at the end.
So where do you end up when you're doing these projections? We heard 12 million barrels per day more in your projection. Where do you end up in your projections?
So we have 3 case scenarios, and I would not say that they deviate that much more from a lot of the other groups, including the IEA. On our low case scenario, we see very mild adoption. But again, in terms of demand for transportation fuels, there are policies in place that are going to have a requirement that you have to make certain adjustments in terms of internal combustion efficiencies. So under our mid-case scenario and our high-case scenario, we see an inflection point, but not until 2025. There is a greater range of variability in the trajectory changes once you get out to 2035. But again, depending on your level of adoption, to us it's much more important about understanding the variables and the rate of adoption.
RJ.
Yeah, I mean, these are really interesting questions, right? So if we go to the scenario of additional 12 million barrels a day of growth, that takes us to something like 110 million by 2040. I remember not that long ago, maybe 2008, by 2040 we thought demand would be 130. So somewhere that 20 million barrels has disappeared, and there was a lot of companies that were looking to develop high-cost resources to match that demand. We're talking about cold liquids and biofuels and Arctic and oil sands and all those things. So that's all gone. Right, and one of the reasons why certainly there's a elasticity to the price that we saw, the price spikes we've seen, but also it's the role of governments in shaping behavior, incenting technologies we heard from DOE earlier, and also trying to impact consumer behavior through fuel efficiency standards and other things. I think I would basically agree that we're probably on track for that 110 million barrel scenario, but those policy incentives of energy and security, industrial policy, and environmental policy could push us in a different direction, especially and if that happens in Asia, then those numbers could look very different.
So let's talk about Asia. You just did a bunch of work on that. What are you seeing coming out of China, Japan, and Korea that could actually change this trajectory?
Sure. Well, I think your Asia group has done a lot of work on China Inc. Right? You look at their Made in China 2025 program, and you see how central things like electric vehicles and batteries are to that program. The big question really is, I think we could find a case where China's demand growth starts to slow. It already has to some degree, and could further based on those policies. But is that really transferable now to Southeast Asia and India? Can they really replicate what China Inc. is doing? And I would say probably right now the answer is no, absent a lot of changes. So that's really the key question. I think the market has really become much more comfortable with the sort of steady state of China demand growth and sees a lot more risk to the upside perhaps in India and Southeast Asia.
What about the policies that many of these cities are enacting, that you can't, after a certain point, you can't drive a diesel vehicle or any internal combustion engine in these cities? First of all, how realistic do you think those are? And second, do you think that they'll actually have an impact on consumer preferences, consumer behavior, and the vehicle fleet?
So on these local policies, they need to be complemented with a very strong public transportation infrastructure. If you don't have it, then it's a recipe for doing the same thing over and over again. So if I take, for instance, a question, and I would like to submit it to the Atlantic Council, is on the shared rides. Are they going to displace individual rides, or are they going to displace public transportation? That is a big question. We still don't have an answer today. I mean, in many cities now around the world, it's much more convenient to share a transportation than go to a public transportation. Because of the quality, it takes you an hour and a half to go using public transportation. So these are things that we need to put together in terms of policy. And we also need to have the point that Thomas mentioned, which is the infrastructure from a charging standpoint and the incentives to do it.
Tom, I think you mentioned yesterday in our workshop the idea of unintended consequences, and I think this example of ride sharing is a great one. I live in Washington, D.C., as do several others, and there's been a lot of news about bus ridership being down 10 or 15%, and one of the hypotheses is that Uber and Lyft and ride sharing are really eating into the mass transit demand, which is an interesting case in point. I would say on the cities, a couple things. First of all, I think in the U.S., municipalities are stepping in and sort of filling the policy leadership vacuum in this area from Washington, that the current administration is not as focused on this as the previous one. But having said that, I think while these headlines from places like Madrid and Paris about congestion charges and banning certain types of diesel from the city center are important, I'm much more interested if that happens in Asia, right? Because the growth is so much stronger there, and it would have a bigger impact if they do go that direction.
But coming back to Asia, if you look at what happened for motorbikes in Beijing, it's quite impressive. You almost see no gasoline motorbikes.
That's right.
Most of the motorbikes are now electrical. And that happened over the last 2-3 years.
Yeah, and that goes to show you this portfolio idea, right? That it's not, you know, not just the passenger side, but also the industrial side, but the scooters and motorbikes that had a big impact.
So that actually goes to the next question, which is, and we talk a lot about EVs, but that's only a part of the story. What are the other changes that need to happen in other sectors, whether you're talking about heavy trucking or aviation, as we saw earlier, or shipping? What else needs to happen in order to see, to really change that future demand that you're talking about here?
So on the tracking side is, if we look at the demand growth until 2040, we're looking at 4 to 5 million barrels per day additional just from the trucking alone. So that is quite significant. What do we need to do there? Last year we worked on a modern truck scenario, which looks at ways of reducing that demand, and you need to have a combination of factors. We don't have today fuel efficiency standards for trucks. That is, there are a handful number of set of countries that have fuel efficiency for standards for trucks. The second one is use digitalization and the power of digitalization to decrease the cost of transportation and the kilometer footprint of trucks. You can pull things in a much more efficient way, and this is something that we need to develop to reduce the trucking traffic.
I'll take the question a little bit differently. Not that I disagree. I think one important difference how we view the subject matter is the rate of adoption is not only going to lead itself to crossover technologies that might be applicable to buses, trucks, and airplanes, but we see it as being required. And I'll tell you specifically what I mean by that. If you take a look at the global market and you think that, you know, primary fuels like gasoline really set global demand for oil, there's a certain refinery configuration or yield required to do that. If we go from a world that consumes 90 million barrels of oil per day, and let's say it's 80 million barrels a day, right? Jet fuel, for instance, since we were talking about aviation, has about a 10% yield on average, let's say. So out of that, you get 9 million barrels of jet fuel supply. What happens if you do displace 10 million barrels of gasoline and you can only provide 8 million barrels of supply to the jet fuel industry? You create shortages in certain products.
Right.
And, you know, as I say, the only thing worse than policy or no policy is a bad policy. And we're going to create a lot of unintended consequences if there is too much of a rapid rate of adoption without coordination across all the industries. And I think we need to be careful, too, as analysts when we make commentary or we don't provide enough support for our industry and the views. There is a lot of investment and reinvestments that are required simply to meet the near-term demands for crude. But as we think about the rate of adoption, and I think on almost all of our scenarios, we don't see a real rapid rate of adoption until you get past 2025, maybe to 2030. But over that same time frame, if you take a look at the demand for petrochemicals, GDP minus the recycling ratio, you can make a very strong argument that the demand for petrochemicals can actually surpass the efficiency you see from electric vehicles over the same time period. And that's an important responsibility when we go out and we represent ourselves to the global industry.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because if you look at the divergence among the super majors and probably some of the national oil companies too in terms of their peak demand forecast, and ExxonMobil and Chevron, their sort of public outlooks have said that they don't really see a peak of demand, large part because of petrochemical demand growth offsetting some of these changes in transportation. As you say, the problem really is that that creates a little bit of uncertainty in terms of these longer cycle investments, right? And then, if you have these wildly different long-term forecasts, how do you really justify a longer cycle investment? But to go back to trucking for a second, I wanted to mention Walmart as an interesting case study, right? Because you think about, they've announced a 1 gigaton carbon reduction goal, and much like sort of China, they have a combination of energy security concerns, environmental policy concerns, and business or industrial policy, right? And for them, it is the fleet utilization. They don't necessarily need to go to electric trucks or some radical change. There's a lot of things they could do with better management of the fleet and their stores to manage that as well. So I agree with you that some of those incremental changes could have a big impact as well.
Right. So before we take questions from the audience, I want to do sort of one final round, which is really the point of the project you're working on, which is what does this all mean for geoeconomics and geopolitics? There are potential winners and losers across many of these different scenarios. Who are the winners and losers in the sort of slow, medium, and fast adoption scenarios? So start with RJ.
Well, I think one of the ways that Eurasia Group has been thinking about this is sort of, who could be the next Venezuela, right? That, we've seen that in the Venezuelan case, the lack of economic diversification, the relative weakness of the political institutions has meant that even in this sort of cyclical downturn we've had, at least in the last few months, it's really created a crisis there. So what other countries have that same set of conditions? I don't necessarily think it's in this part of the world. I think it may be more West Africa, for example, I would look at, perhaps certain parts of the former Soviet Union. And then on the winner side, I think, again, Megan O'Sullivan made a good point yesterday about China maybe having the opportunity to shift their foreign policy away from pure energy security concerns. They're not competing with the U.S. to the same extent for, the marginal resource, gives them a little more flexibility. But those are the kind of questions we would want to look at.
Yeah. Tom.
To steal a quote, the Stone Age did not end from a lack of rock, nor would the oil age end from a lack of oil. I think the industries that people most expect to suffer have an opportunity to reinvent themselves. And if you take a look at oil companies what are specifically expected to be the people or the groups that suffer, we are seeing companies reach out and think about things like, well, there's a strong demand for infrastructure. Who has existing infrastructure? Retail gasoline stations. There are a number of ways I think that the industries can go out and reinvent themselves and take advantage of the current situations. But I do believe, and I do agree with the studies that you've shared with us from the Atlantic Council, that there are economies that are still tied to oil dependency and need to find ways to rapidly shift their economies towards a more diversified approach.
Come on.
So if I look at it from an ADNOC standpoint, the strategy, the 2030 strategy of ADNOC is heavily focusing on petrochemicals.
Right.
So we are looking at tripling the production of petrochemicals by 2025, going to 25 million tons per annum. So this is one way of diversifying into an area which is a very significant element of growth, as we have discussed with the colleagues. Now, going on a global basis, I would say that it's going to be a very mixed picture. One of my biggest area of concerns is what happened with the cars after they finished their 15 or 20 years in the OECD economies. Mm-hmm. Will they go to non-OECD economies like we are seeing in Africa and so on? And then this would not help those economies. So what we need to do is make sure that that transition is going across the world and that we don't have these pockets of people that are left behind.
Right. So one of the researchers at the Atlantic Council who's working on a very long-term energy mix projection after 2060, actually, very much sees this as a problem where he calls it the third owner problem, that trucks and cars will end up hitting the African market, internal combustion engine trucks and cars, around 2050 when there'll be a huge boom in population in Africa, and we'll see a demand spike in oil again.
Yeah,
that's his projection.
Perversely, one of the real issues you have to think about with that scenario is it's not really the transportation fuel you need to understand for that, because transportation fuel is a little bit more than half of oil demand growth. The other half of it is non-transportation demand. As I talked about before about the flexibility refining system, if you have other areas of petroleum demand that cannot find substitutions, what you'll be required to do is not solving for oil demand through primary products like gasoline, but solving for oil demand through other sources where you cannot find adequate substitution. As a result, what you end up doing is making gasoline a make-it-go-away product, similar to what the United States found with ethane. So what will happen is the United States will be forced to produce a certain amount of gasoline, export the gasoline to areas that might not have the same type of economic advantages, economies of scale for the power grid, for charging stations. And thereby you do create a bifurcated global market with respect to internal combustion engines and maybe non-OECD areas, and electric vehicles maybe at a higher rate of adoption, and those that have the economies and the scale size to accommodate.
Right. So I'd like to turn this over to the audience. Thank you guys so much. But also welcome Mark and Lyndon back to the stage in case anyone has some questions for them. Come on up, and then let's see, do we have any questions out here? Is Bob Armstrong in the audience? He was going to talk about consumer behavior. He has a great study, but I don't see him. Well, then let's keep talking. I want to talk about biofuels. Come on up here for a second. Because what Tom said is that there's going to be this potential problem where there's going to be a lack of jet fuel. Do you think that the biofuels could compensate for that? And is that something that you see, is that part of your thinking? And is that part of why ADNOC is thinking about this? Yes, please. Oh, you've been de-mic'd.
They're using it for something else. Sorry, sorry, I didn't quite catch the beginning of that.
So what Tom is saying is that if there's a reduction in oil demand, say by 10 million barrels a day, that you're going to lose jet fuel production because of that. Do we think that biofuels can make up for some of that problem? And is that part of why ADNOC is involved with this?
I'm not sure that that's necessarily the reason why ADNOC's involved in it. I think they do genuinely see this as something that they need to get involved in, and it supports the UAE economy, it supports diversification, and they see it as an additional stream. I mean, ideally what we'd like to see is they build the capability within their existing refineries in order to be able to do that. I'm not sure. I think one of the issues for us is not so much about this drop in demand, but it's more about maybe the jet fuel availability in some places. You know, the lack of the willingness by the refineries, particularly in the likes of North America, where they're seeing very heavy crudes. Here we have a light sweet crude, so it's a fairly easy process. But I think in say the west coast of the US, I know they're having issues with actually the refining process. So I think that's something that is possibly an issue for us, and we're looking at. And also we are seeing, which is quite interesting with these biofuels, we're actually seeing an additional energy value. Up to 4 or 5%, and that could be the difference for us when there's such a demand now for long haul travel and no stops. You know, like traveling from the UK to Australia, for example, is they're starting to think about those kind of length routes. 1 or 2% more energy value will make a real difference to us to not having to make that stop. You know, so I think there's a definite, and also potentially losing payload, which we have to do. You know, in certain weather conditions, we know that if we're flying from here to the west coast, there are times when we can't carry as much cargo and we can't get that full payload, but that extra value added.
Right.
Yeah.
Kamal had a comment.
I had a comment. One of our partners, ExxonMobil, one of their significant investment in R&D today is in algae.
Right.
And they are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on algae for biofuels. So looking at alternative fuels is not exogenous to oil and gas companies.
Yeah. Thank you. We had a question from the audience, David Livingston right there, and then the next one will be on the side over here.
Thanks very much. David Livingston with the Atlantic Council. I wanted to follow up on Tom's interesting comments on the bifurcated future scenario to just ask what that implies for refinery investment also around the world. Does this mean that we're going to see different trends in refinery investment in places like Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa? Are we going to see more developments like the kind of Dangote refinery idea in Nigeria? Or is this bifurcated future completely agnostic to future refinery investment trends?
Thank you for your question. In my view, I think the ultimate outcome is going to be contingent based upon the U.S. refining and the global refining system's ability to adapt to change. Now, as you know, I think one of the bigger variables that we're trying to deal with and we've been discussing today is the rate of adoption. I think we've all made the assumption that we are going to move into an electrified economy. But what will that rate of adoption be? I think to the extent that you have a very fast rate of adoption, it's going to be problematic for that. But there will be issues around the configurations. I mean, everybody knows that the U.S. refining toolkit has been upgraded, and you need heavy crude processing. To the extent that we don't have requirements for light fuels, there's going to have to change in that fuel kit. The willingness or unwillingness to do that and the ability for those refiners to meet the local demand requirements are certainly going to play a factor. But there is another thing to think about when you think about the relationship between the United States and also the Europeans. We have the transatlantic product arbitrage. We expect a very fast rate of adoption in China, as the Eurasia group. We think that the U.S. will be second to that. We don't see very much growth coming out of Europe. To the extent that we have a rapid decline in gasoline demand in the United States, as a byproduct, you have less distillate produced. How do you satisfy that demand in Europe? What you may have to see in situations like that, and we're not even really talking about a bifurcated global market, but within the OECD, you may have to increase the refining runs and build additional refining capacity that are configured for the European market if you don't have a similar rate of adoption for electric vehicles. So it puts an upward bias on electric fuel adoption as a result of higher diesel prices per se. I hope that answers your question.
Right over there.
So currently, a lot of governments are supporting the adoption of EVs by subsidies and other means. But what happens if mass adoption of EVs leads to significant less taxation? And I'm talking impact on budgets, both from the producing nations, but also on the consuming nations that tax gasoline and diesel heavily. What thoughts do you have, and what impact do you think that could have on some of the geopolitics?
Please.
Perhaps that's a very good comment. I would say that governments are extremely creative in terms of creating new taxes, and I don't have an issue from that standpoint that there would be new ways of getting back what they are losing on the taxation of gasoline. And
I would agree, or at least half agree, because I think I certainly agree on the consumer side that there'll be massive taxes on electric vehicles eventually. Right now we're kind of incenting, but at some point they'll have to replace the revenue that you mentioned, whether it's a charging or who knows what that will look like. I would be more worried about the producer side, and that may be harder to find that revenue, and that gets into what I said earlier about the resilience concept of which countries will be able to find the revenue to balance their budget and sort of provide social public goods without that revenue. So that's probably the key question I would see.
Anyone else in the audience? I have a question for Mark.
Randy, by the way, on that, just real quick, I want to say, because you mentioned cobalt earlier, right, that I noticed this week that, speaking of tax, that the Democratic Republic of Congo is doubling the royalty on cobalt. So the sort of resource cycle is happening once again.
I just had an additional comment. One sector we didn't talk about is the maritime sector, which will represent a significant area of growth. And we're also seeing a transformation because of the IMO rules and the shift in fuel for that. There is an opportunity there for switching to LNG. And I hope that some of the big maritime companies will take this opportunity to leapfrog and go to a more, let's say, sustainable source.
And in my initial conversations with the maritime industry, they see regulation in the future and want to get ahead of that, and so they're already starting to think about efficiency, LNG, et cetera. There's just a lot of easy wins there for them. So
I would just add, I mean, when you think about the IMO and the low sulfur fuel specs heading by 2020, I don't think anybody's ahead of that, and I think that people and places in the market really need to come to the acknowledgement there's a very real and present risk of noncompliance.
Question on infrastructure for Mark. One of the questions RJ and I have been talking about is, what happens if there's a rapid adoption of electric vehicles? How do you provide all that electricity? Now you have some of that with sort of grid management where you're charging at low demand times, et cetera. But is that one of your fears, one of Renault's fears in terms of actually having that be a roadblock to a full adoption of this technology?
I think it has to be. Infrastructure is one of the main things that will drive this from the consumer point of view. Without infrastructure, a consumer still has range anxiety, for example. But what you see in Europe already, what people are adopting now is Shell have taken the lead, and they're looking to develop already, as Tom earlier said, about looking for different ways, the oil producers looking for different ways what they can do with their business model, with introducing electric vehicle charging stations at all fuel stations. So that's a need, and I think that's something that's happened here as well. If we see what Dubai have done earlier in the year, or over the last year, 100 charging stations, and it'll be 200 charging stations by the end of 2018. In a market, really, which is an oil-governed market, that we have to say, we're seeing a change. But consumers, until they feel safe, you need to have an infrastructure. Demand is, on the second question, demand is the next thing, and that's why I said earlier, is that for Renault have already looked at energy supplies. We're working with different partners because we know demand on grids is massive, especially in Europe. There is a big switch. I mean, if I take from UK, there's looking to switch to more nuclear to meet demand. And as we go forward, if we've got 200,000 electric vehicles operating in the market, the demand on the electricity grids obviously go down, and it causes bigger problems. So it's a long-term investment, it's a long-term strategy that needs to be thought of now with policy from governments to be able to make it sustainable.
Thank you so much. I've been given the 0-minute warning, so it's time to end. I hope that you'll come back next year and we're actually talking about flying cars and solar planes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate your presentations and your fascinating discussion. And keep an eye out for the work that RJ is doing over the course of the next year, and we'll probably be releasing a study here based on a whole bunch of conversations we're having next January here in Abu Dhabi. So thank you all so much for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. There's going to be a 15-minute coffee break, and then the next sessions will begin at 10:45 or so. The one that's in here is called The Future of OPEC and Oil Markets. That's going to be fascinating. And then the one downstairs, Economic Diversification, Sustainable Best Practices and Business Models. Both conversations are really relevant, actually, to what we were just talking about. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to talking with you throughout the rest of the day.